Local governments cooperating with ICE, Governor Shapiro's security, America's talking, and Illinois' Bears deal. This is the Center Square Daily for Friday, April 24th, 2026. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. In Houston, Texas, officials and Governor Greg Abbott reaching an agreement restoring cooperation between the Houston Police Department and federal immigration authorities after the Houston City Council passed an ordinance restricting HPD interactions with ICE officers enforcing final deportation orders. The state announced they were withdrawing over $114 million in public safety grants. An amended ordinance and a new HPD directive now align with state grant requirements and federal law. The governor confirmed the funding would be restored following compliance. Now, the move followed constructive conversations between the mayor and the governor amid ongoing lawsuits and pressure on other cities like Austin and Dallas. Now, this development came against the backdrop of another high-profile case in Houston. A 19-year-old Venezuelan national faces murder charges in the sledgehammer bludgeoning death of a carpenter. The suspect in that case, who entered the U.S. under prior parole policies and had a prior criminal history, was arrested driving the victim's vehicle. Officials highlighting the case as underscoring the risks from limited local federal cooperation, noting patterns in similar instances involving Venezuelan nationals. In Arizona, legal experts say that state law prohibits local restrictions on federal immigration enforcement taking precedent over city or county policies. Recent actions in Pima County and Phoenix banning or limiting ICE use of local property without permission has drawn complaints to the Attorney General. Analysts cite Arizona statutes and constitutional principles like the Supremacy Clause, noting that while localities aren't required to assist federal efforts, they cannot obstruct them. State law in Arizona is viewed as overriding conflicting local measures. Now, this runs contrary to some other local and state governments like Illinois and California, where state law there prohibits such cooperation. Leaders in these states, they argue, even in the judiciary, that state and local resources cannot be commandeered by federal officials to enforce federal law. Meanwhile, nationally, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in a migrant parole case involving a Chinese national convicted of trademark counterfeit. Justices appeared skeptical of arguments that would broadly expand admissibility standards for individuals facing criminal suspicions or charges. The case examines the clear and convincing evidence standard for admissibility under parole and removal proceedings. A decision in that case expected by July. Down in Florida, the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld an earlier ruling keeping the so-called alligator Alcatraz detention facility in the Everglades operational. The court blocked the lower court's order to wind down that site, citing issues with the challenger's claims under the Administrative Procedure Act. Other developments include the Atlanta City Council passing resolutions on immigration enforcement ahead of the World Cup, and reports of fugitives arrested in New England sanctuary areas on homicide charges. Now, what about the U.S. Department of Homeland Security funding? Congress has not passed the 2026 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. It's the only remaining fiscal year 26 funding measure. This has resulted in a partial DHS funding lapse since mid-February, now exceeding 60 to 70 days, marking the longest partial government shutdown in U.S. history. Now, DHS agencies, including Transportation Security Administration, FEMA, Coast Guard, and Secret Service, they continue their essential operations with many employees working without pay, leading to reported airport delays and nearly $1 billion in delayed paychecks when combined with prior lapses. Now, ICE and border enforcement operations have largely continued due to prior supplemental funding from the Republicans' One Big Beautiful Bill, though officials note there are limitations. A Senate-passed hybrid Homeland Security bill would fund non-immigration components like TSA, FEMA, and others for the remainder of the fiscal year. But Washington U.S. Senator Patty Murray and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, they criticized Republicans wanting to fund an agency they say needs more accountability.
Republicans want to give $140 billion to ICE and Border Patrol. And these are agencies highly unpopular, unreformed with the American people. Their right wing is driving them over a cliff. Republicans are at each other's throats, tying their party up in knots.
I've not heard one Democrat say defund ICE.
Yeah.
What I have heard every single Democrat repeatedly say, when you fund ICE agents, then make sure they have training, make sure they have warrants, make sure they act like law enforcers, and have the ability to have the trust of the American people. That's what we're asking for.
Now, the Senate bill that funds DHS awaits action in the U.S. House. Republicans, they're advancing a separate budget reconciliation measure to provide additional immigration enforcement funding, including for ICE and CBP. Lawmakers are also beginning fiscal year 2027 appropriations discussions, with DHS agencies requesting approximately $63 billion. No full government shutdowns occurred, but the impasse has drawn criticism from both sides over priorities, with ongoing negotiations to resolve the lapse. Now, be sure to stay up on the latest on border issues and DHS funding by getting the newsletter from thecentersquare.com. Last year, Pennsylvania Governor Shapiro and his family were sleeping when the official governor's mansion was firebombed. He then had security upgrades to his private residence in a different location. Now there's a fight over who should pay for it. Joining us to discuss the latest on this developing story is the Center Square Regional Editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, thanks for taking time with us. The Shapiro administration says the payments were authorized by state police and approved by the Attorney General's office. What's the Treasurer's counter to that?
Treasurer disagrees completely and thinks that in her purview as treasurer and the person who authorizes payments to the state police in this case, that it isn't legal for her to send out this money. I think the crux of the issue is, should public money, taxpayer money, be used to pay for security upgrades at the governor's private residence? Certainly the money that was spent to upgrade and to restore the governor's residence in Harrisburg, that was appropriated in the state budget. But there is a lot of concern both among lawmakers and certainly Republicans, of which Stacy Garrity is one, and they continue to raise questions about this spending.
And I guess one question would be, could it set a precedent for future governors or even other state officials, local officials that might say that they feel threatened? Is this going to set a precedent if this does allow for the taxpayers to cover private security for private residences?
That's an excellent question, Greg, because we are living in a time of really heightened political violence. There's been a lot of attacks on lawmakers and influencers on both sides of the aisle. And Josh Shapiro has kind of become, at least of what we refer to in Pennsylvania, he's kind of become the spokesman of civility on this. He's spoken a lot about his experience in the wake of the firebombing attack, in which the suspect was convicted for attempted murder. And he spent a lot of time saying, let's bring down the temperature, let's do what we can. But at the same time, there's threats to lawmakers all of the time. And you've got to wonder, at what point can they say, all right, well, our homes need these upgrades too. We're at danger. And there's an argument to be made there that, sure, if you're a public figure and you are espousing political beliefs, that there is someone who could target you. But certainly when we're talking over $1 million of taxpayer funds, it certainly, again, raises questions about how much taxpayers should be affording.
Yeah, both Treasurer Garrity and Shapiro, they're electoral opponents in November. How much do you think that this is actually political versus making sure that taxpayers have some accountability for how their tax dollars are spent?
Well, if you ask Shapiro's team, they argue that this is nothing more than a political attack, and in fact, that they think it's despicable given what happened to the governor and his family. Stacy Garrity has said that she absolutely supports protecting the family and upgrading the governor's residence and making sure that he has the security that he needs. That being said, the political lens of the optics of this situation, it's hard to ignore that. She is in what everyone seems to agree will be an uphill battle against Shapiro for the governor's mansion in November. And so her platform of fiscal responsibility. This is really well within that wheelhouse for her. Democrats, of course, also back Shapiro, say this is a political attack. This is nothing more than her just trying to gain points with voters. If you ask Republicans, who particularly in the Senate have been questioning this expenditure for much longer than Treasurer Garrity has even brought it up for, they too say, why did we spend this money? And to your point, what precedent does it set?
You know, in Illinois, there have been conversations, I think, sparked by what happened in Pennsylvania, and just as you highlighted, the heightened political division that is leading in some instances to some political violence. Illinois lawmakers toying with the idea of using campaign funds, allowing for those dollars to go towards private security. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about taxpayers here. So Shapiro is looking to have the taxpayers cover this. What's the treasurer saying is the legal mechanism that keeps that from happening, that protects taxpayers from that?
As far as I understand, it is her role as treasurer to authorize those payments. So really, she is what is protecting or preventing this payment from going through based on your perspective. And to your point, there's a huge difference between campaign funds and taxpayer funds. Taxpayers don't have a choice, whether or not they align politically with who's in the governor's mansion or who's in the representative office. They don't have a choice about where their taxpayer money goes. Unfortunately, they vote for, that's why we do what we do. They vote for one thing, their money may go somewhere else. So this is a very clear example of that. In campaign funding, of course, the people who are obviously donating to Shapiro's campaign have a vested interest in what happens to him. So there has been no conversation about how to appropriately fund this beyond the legislature making a general appropriation in the next budget, which is due in June.
Obviously, you've got the issue of security, and as we highlighted, the divide there is, but has there been any precedent in the past of this happening that you've been able to find in Pennsylvania or elsewhere where the question of taxpayer-funded security has been brought up?
This is, to my knowledge, a relatively newer situation. There's been a lot of course, attacks and concerns within the legislature itself against lawmakers. In fact, Representative Mark Gillen just this week, an Ohio man who was accused of threatening him with death for his potential votes on gun policy, that, he was just arrested this past week. In the past, there's been lawmakers who were attacked outside of the Capitol, although the motive in those cases is less clear. So it's not that security hasn't been a concern among lawmakers for years, but never has anyone thought that perhaps we should look for a taxpayer-funded solution for this.
Now, there's another element here, Kristen, that's kind of interesting. How often does Governor Shapiro actually stay at the governor's mansion? And isn't that like part of the perks of the job? You get a highly secure mansion with taxpayer-funded security that, it's the people's house is what we call the governor's mansion in Illinois. How often is Shapiro actually and his family in that residence?
I can't say for sure. They're quite good about keeping that information under lock and key. However, he often does celebrate very public events there. In fact, he was celebrating the Passover when the firebombing happened. And his private residence is in Montgomery County, which is just outside of Philadelphia. So it's not that he lives close by. Quite infamously or notably, Governor Tom Wolf, who preceded him in office, refused to stay in the governor's mansion. He lived in York, and so that's very close, and he refused to stay there. He refused to use Capitol security vehicles. He would drive his Jeep. It was really part of his image. Shapiro, as far as I can tell, does not prescribe to that public image. He's certainly surrounded by security at all times, but he definitely does have much more of a presence in Harrisburg and at the mansion than his predecessor.
I know every 4 years when we have an election in Illinois, that's one of the big questions, whoever's running for governor. So you going to live in the governor's mansion or not? Because a lot of times it's a Chicago politician or Chicago area politician that's 3.5 hours away from Springfield, the state capital. But taxpayers are paying for this big building to upkeep it and have a chef on hand and have security wrapped around that entire building, even if it's empty.
Right.
Well, Kristen, greatly appreciate you taking the time. We'll definitely be encouraging people to go check out the latest of what's going on in Pennsylvania at thecentersquare.com. Now it's time for America's Talking with headlines from across the country, and you can find these in the description below or in your inbox with the Center Square newsletter, free at thecentersquare.com. Also find us anywhere on social media. The Trump administration Thursday moved medical marijuana from one of the most restricted drug classifications to a less regulated category. An historic shift that delivers a tax break for cannabis businesses but stops short of federal legalization. The Center Square investigative reporter Brett Rowland reports Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche issued an order immediately placing both FDA-approved marijuana products and marijuana regulated by state medical licenses in Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. A new administrative hearing will begin June 29th to consider broader rescheduling of marijuana overall. The action follows a December 2025 executive order in which the president directed the Justice Department to complete the rescheduling process as quickly as possible. Marijuana has been classified as a Schedule 1 drug alongside heroin, LSD, and ecstasy since 1970. A designation defined as drugs with no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Schedule 3 drugs, on the other hand, include ketamine and products containing low doses of codeine and are defined as having moderate to low potential for physical or psychological dependence. A business plan is due soon for California's High-Speed Rail Authority, detailing funding gaps and explaining its plans to where they're going to find the money. The Center Square, California reporter Madeline Shannon reports Assembly Bill 377, which is passed and signed into law in 2025, requires the agency to operate the state's as yet unbuilt high-speed rail to include funding information, including financial gaps, in the Mercer to Bakersfield segment to the legislature in the agency's annual business plan. Now, under the bill, the business plan has to include details, such as an estimate of the gap in funding and a strategy to fix that gap. Ahead of the report required by May 1st, the agency released a draft business plan that shows a commitment of $1 billion a year through 2045 from the state's Cap and Trade program, also known as Cap and Invest. According to the most recent cost estimates for the project in San Francisco to Bakersfield segment, it's projected to cost $60.3 billion. And even nearly $10 million from Congressional Leadership Fund being directed to fall reservations in 3 media markets for North Carolina and Virginia voters, pivotal in the 2026 midterms. Republican efforts to flip old state seats. The Center Square managing editor Alan Wooten reporting the total includes $4.7 million for Riley and $2.6 million in the Greenville New Bern markets in the coastal plain of North Carolina. Another $2.5 million slated for Norfolk, Virginia, the media market that includes 8 northeastern counties of North Carolina. The fund is the super PAC endorsed by House Speaker Mike Johnson and House Republican leadership. Now, in all, the Political Action Committee spending $153.1 million across 38 markets for broadcast, cable, streaming, and digital platforms. And finally, the Georgia Secretary of State's office said Thursday it opposes any efforts to change elections before the November primary, setting up a conflict with the state election board. The election board agreed Wednesday to consider a proposal from the Coalition for Good Governance that would declare the current system unusable and force election workers to use hand-marked ballots. Georgia law allows the use of a paper ballot backup system if using the current voting system is, quote, impossible or impractical. The rule under consideration by the state election board is based on information from the Coalition for Good Governance that the current voting system cannot be trusted because it does not produce a hand-readable official vote or keep ballots secret. Mark's telling the state elections board members that they have a statutory duty to invoke a rule. The Secretary of State's office and election board chairman, John Fever, disagrees. And that's just some of what America is talking about. Get these and other headlines at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Center Square Daily. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. It's now up to the Illinois Senate about whether the honey jar for the Bears could be sweeter after the House passed their version of a deal Wednesday. This coming, of course, as additional amendments are necessary, according to the Bears, for their Arlington Heights plans. The Bears putting out a statement saying that they support Illinois leaders as they determine the path forward to make the essential changes to the mega projects bill and align it with infrastructure funding. Now, this all coming as the Illinois House Wednesday, passing a 300-plus page bill with last-minute amendments splitting Democrats and Republicans with both bipartisan support and bipartisan opposition. And the bill, while it doesn't just impact the Bears looking to possibly set up a mega entertainment complex in Arlington Heights, as long as they can get some tax carve-outs and some incentives and some infrastructure costs covered by the taxpayers, or they could go to Indiana, who passed a bill and the governor signed in Indiana to sweeten and entice the Bears to come to that state. But Governor J.B. Pritzker this morning was asked about the pace of Illinois' deal and what's coming up next.
I can tell you that there is a need to, for speed here. We need to move somewhat expeditiously. I realize the Senate has some work to do, and there will be amendments, no doubt about it. Some of it, I think, for the Bears anyway, didn't make sense. And so, well, again, I don't want to, I think they're working that through with the Senate. I don't want to get involved here in front of all of you. I think there's just aspects of it that I guess I'll give you one example. They had said at the outset that an amusement tax is something that really won't work, and that they really don't want to see happen on top of all the other taxes that are imposed here. So, when I think it's a 9% amusement tax has been put on by the House, obviously that's something that they didn't expect. We're obviously trying to keep the Chicago Bears in the state of Illinois. I also want to remind you that this bill wasn't about the Chicago Bears alone. This bill is really about economic development broadly for the state. It's a mega projects bill because we have a bunch of mega projects that we can attract to Illinois if we have the right structure for folks to deal with property taxes, which, by the way, they do.
Now, the governor does say that people want property tax relief, but Republicans criticizing this bill, saying this isn't about broad property tax relief in the state of Illinois with the highest property taxes. They say it's a carve-out that the government is picking winners and losers, with regular residences having to pay high property taxes while mega projects like the Chicago Bears will get property tax deals. Americans for Prosperity also criticizing the deal, saying that while it's going to be great and lower the property tax to among the lowest in the country for these specific areas with so-called mega projects, it's not going to do much to help those who are paying the highest property taxes, including small businesses who Americans for Prosperity warn are going to be impacted negatively by this if they're not in those mega project districts. The Center Square also talked with economist J.C. Bradbury, who criticized the deal.
I think that you can't really blame professional sports team owners for asking, because they've learned that politicians will give them whatever they ask for. And I think what it's important to remember from the public perspective is that these teams don't want to leave. And so right in Chicago, Illinois taxpayers faced the same things back in the 1980s when Jerry Reinsdorf threatened to move the Chicago White Sox. Their good buddy happened to be the owner's good friend happened to be the governor of Illinois, and he basically threatened local representatives to fund the stadium. And then afterwards it was over. Jerry Reinsdorf openly admitted that he wasn't planning to move the team. And so even though we have these threats, I think a lot of times they're cheap talk.
Now, the state's economy, clearly an issue in all of this. While the governor touts some lists with Chicago high up for certain types of attraction for corporations, the Tax Foundation regularly puts Illinois among some of the most expensive tax policies in the country for both corporations, small businesses, and individuals. The state of Illinois has got the second highest gas tax when you compare workers' comp costs to neighboring states, another added item for businesses and their increased costs. The governor, he seems to reflect and say, yes, indeed, people are looking at taxes, and in particular property taxes, and everybody wants relief, but he's also looking to balance that with what they can do to attract the Bears to Illinois.
Listen, we all want property tax relief. There's no doubt about that. I think that what we want to make sure is that, if there's property tax relief, that it's meaningful, that it doesn't, penalize the bears in their desire to stay in the state of Illinois, but that also benefits particularly the surrounding communities, but also perhaps the larger community of people who own property in the state. Yeah, we're always competing with other states for businesses, and this is just another example of that. And so the Bears have a meeting. The NFL has a meeting next week. It's not going to, completely flip the script, and all of a sudden on that date you're going to see, Indiana is being chosen if Illinois doesn't have a bill. Having said that, if there is not true progress that gets made, if it isn't obvious to people that the Senate is moving in the right direction, I think that will make it challenging. But we're all working together. I think, the Bears want to be in Illinois. I think that's really what their choice would be if we can put a bill forward that makes sense.
Whatever does come together in the Illinois Senate and changes made to the House bill, the economist, J.C. Bradbury, doesn't have much faith in it being a win for taxpayers.
Basically, economists have been studying public stadiums for about 5 decades, and there has not been one instance that I'm aware of in which the stadium has actually paid for itself, that has generated enough revenue to pay back taxpayers for the amount generated. This isn't an investment, it's a subsidy. And the Bears are a private organization. The team is worth, well over $1 billion. And it's just not a legitimate function of government. And I think it's also important to realize the Bears have a relatively new stadium, and that you take Soldier Field, which actually is quite old in its shell, but it was basically rebuilt for the Bears in 2003. And that stadium isn't even paid off. So there's really no reason for the Bears to even demand a new stadium for a place to play. It's not even that old.
Now, the Senate, they return next week. Both the Illinois House and Senate return the following week. And the deadline to pass bills, including this potential bill with simple majorities, set for May 31st. Be sure to stay up to speed with the latest on Illinois and get the newsletter at thecentersquare.com. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop, and you can join us back here Monday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from around the country, only with the Center Square Daily.